Hi, I'm Steve Endo, and I'm a Microsoft MVP. And I was wondering whether I could code Azure Functions on an iPad. And in the process, I learned quite a few things, including about the Azure Functions continuous deployment option, as well as how to develop and deploy code using an iPad. Let's take a look. Yes, an iPad, and even an iPhone, and probably Android devices as well. Basically, any device that has Git support can theoretically be used to develop .NET code that can be deployed to Azure Functions using continuous deployment. So why did I go through this process? And it was primarily to see how many tasks I could accomplish on my iPad. I'm able to easily do email, able to browse the web, I'm able to handle customer support tickets through an app on the iPad. I'm able to easily compose text and documentation in OneNote on the iPad with keyboard. And every single thing I tried to do, I was able to generally accomplish it using the iPad. And it was slightly different than how I might do it on my workstation or my Windows laptop. But using slightly different applications or a slightly different process, it is quite amazing how many things you can accomplish on an iPad. And also, one of the things I notice is that I can often be more productive on the iPad. I don't have as many interruptions. I don't have Windows updates constantly popping up. I don't have as many application updates occurring while I'm working. They occur after hours automatically. So I find I have fewer distractions, fewer interruptions, fewer glitches and problems on an iPad versus my laptop. So if I have 15 minutes to get some work done, I'm much more likely to grab my iPad, pull it out, get some work done, reply to some emails, handle some support cases, send some invoices, do all that on an iPad without touching my laptop. So I thought, hey, let's see if I can code on my iPad. And it was an interesting experience, and I'm about to show you what I found. So the first step in coding Azure Functions on an iPad is to create the base Azure Function project in Visual Studio. In theory, you could hand code this from scratch, but it's not worth it. It's much easier to just open Visual Studio, use one of the templates, create the base function. Once you have that base function, you just need to push it to a Git repo. So in my case, I use Bitbucket, and so I created my Azure Function project, pushed it to my Bitbucket repository, and that was the base setup that I had to do on a workstation or Windows laptop. From there, you can modify the Azure functions in the Azure portal to use continuous deployment, which means that it will look to your Git repository for any changes. And when any changes are submitted to that Git repo, Azure Functions will pull down the latest code, recompile it, and deploy it automatically for you. So that's the process that allows me to make changes to the code on my iPad, check it into Git, and have it automatically deployed by Azure Functions without having to do a Visual Studio build, Visual Studio deploy. So it's a little bit of a workaround, but it works quite well. So this is the deployment center in Azure Functions that allows you to enable continuous deployment. And with a few clicks, you open this up, you choose your GitHub repository, authenticate with it, and tell it which repo you want it to monitor. And once you do that, a few clicks later, it says, great, I'll pull down any changes and I'll automatically build and deploy them for you. So let's take a look at what this looks like. I'm first going to modify Visual Studio Code for Azure Functions on the iPad. I'm going to commit those changes to my local Git repo. Then I'm going to push those up to my Bitbucket repository. And once that happens, Azure Functions will rebuild, redeploy. We'll do some tests, and I'll show you how to verify that all on the iPad. So first, you see that my Azure function here, Azure FNCD for continuous deployment, this is set up under the Deployment Center to sync with my Bitbucket repository. So that first has been set up in Azure Portal. I will then go over to my development tool on the iPad. This development tool allows me to have projects that I pull down from my Bitbucket repository. So you see I have my Azure FN CD project. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to take a look at my C#. And so this is the same C# that you would edit in Visual Studio. I'm going to scroll down and let's make some changes here. So edited on iPad. Okay, so now that I made those changes, I'm going to press the little check mark in the upper right corner. Okay, and that is a local commit. I can then close that CS file, click on the little plus sign at the top left by my project name, and I'm going to select Push to Remote. It's then going to push those changes up to Bitbucket. So now let's go back to my Azure function in the portal, and if I refresh here, you'll notice that I have a pending sync right here. So it's saying, hey, I noticed that you just uploaded a new version to the Bitbucket repo. What it's going to do is pull those changes down, which it's doing now. It's running the deployment. And while that is building the new version, let's take a look at how we would test. One way is you can test this in a browser. So here's the output of this Azure function. It displays the version number and it displays a message based on a parameter in the URL. So that's in place. But let's say you wanted something more advanced. Let's say you wanted to manage the parameters other than using the URL. Well, there's an app on the iPad that allows you to do that. And if you're familiar with Postman, this program is essentially equivalent to Postman on Windows. So here I have my request, I have my URL, I have my query parameters, I can specify specific headers if I want, and I can have additional authentication if that's required. So let's go back to the query parameters, and instead of howdy dude, I'm going to say howdy from my iPad. And let's save that parameter. So once I've done making those changes, I'm going to click on the send button and you see howdy from my iPad. So that's how you can test your web services from an iPad, and very similar to the Postman application. So let's go back to Azure Functions. Let's see how it's doing with the deployment. It does take a minute for it to complete. It is still running the deployment, but there we go. Success active. Excellent. So let's go back to our HTTP bot application and let's see how things show up now. You'll notice this takes a few seconds, and that's because the Azure function just got updated. So on that first build or that first call, it does take a few seconds. And there we go. Version 1.0 edited on iPad, howdy from my iPad. So in just a few seconds, I was able to edit my code, commit to Bitbucket, push it up, and Azure Functions pulled it down, rebuilt, and there we go. So let's just make another small change just so that you can see alternative methods. So you notice the version number was displayed here. So that is being pulled from the actual Visual Studio solution build number. So let's go into my CSproj file and you see the assembly version. Let's increment that to 1.001 because I just modified the code. I'd also like to modify the version number. So great, made that minor change. I'll click on the check mark in the upper right. And so updated to version 1.001 from iPad. Okay, so that's my local commit. And now I'm going to push to remote. And that's going to push those changes up to Bitbucket. Excellent. So if you want, we can refresh Bitbucket and we can see updated to version 1.001 from iPad. So now, if we go over to our Azure function in continuous deployment under the Deployment Center, we will see that it immediately detected that new commit and running deployment. And as we saw earlier, this takes a minute to do, but it's totally automatic. We didn't have to trigger anything. We didn't have to tell Azure Functions. We didn't have to do a build. This is all through simple code changes and git commits and pushes from the iPad. So let's go back to our HTTP bot here and let's change our input. And so let's say we are expecting version 001. Let's save that. And let's see how we're doing on the Azure function. There we go. Just switched over to success. And let's go back to HTTP bot and let's click send. And again, first time after a rebuild, Azure Functions do take several seconds to get started. There we go. Version 1.001, it picked up that new version number that I put into the csproj file and edited on iPad. And we're expecting version 1.001. So very powerful. Using only an iPad, I'm able to modify the code, commit to my Git repository, and have Azure Functions automatically detect that, rebuild, and redeploy with zero intervention. Very, very nice process. So as you saw, very impressive process where in a few seconds, I'm able to make changes on an iPad, modify code, get that code deployed automatically, and be able to fully test my solution, which was a web service hosted in Azure Functions, from the iPad. Very, very impressive. No laptop was required. So if you're going to dinner, you're going to lunch, you're going to be out of the office for a day, and you don't want to take your full laptop, you can grab an iPad and have full connectivity, full functionality, and the ability to deploy and maintain code. Doing this on an iPad does require some adjustments. You don't have Visual Studio on an iPad. You don't even have VS Code. So you need to find different applications to do this on a tablet or on a phone or a mobile device that's not a Windows laptop. So it took me a few minutes to search for code editors for iOS, and I found a great editor called Buffer Editor, and it supports dozens of languages. So it has great native support for C# syntax. Now, it does not have autocomplete as far as I can tell, and it is only a code editor. So you can't get IntelliSense, you can't recompile, you can't debug, you can't do compiler type application development on the iPad. But if you need to debug code, review it, push a change, it's an option. Next up, as you saw, is HTTP bot, and this is an alternative to something like Postman. So I wanted to be able to test my Azure function, be able to submit headers and input parameters and verify authentication, and not have to use a browser, which can be a little bit tedious. And HTTP bot is an excellent substitution for Postman on an iPad. Works great. And then lastly, this entire presentation, all the code, all the demonstrations, this was all done on an iPad. I created the PowerPoint on an iPad. I did all of the screenshots on the iPad. I did all of the coding on the iPad. And I even did the video editing on the iPad. So this video that you're watching right now was composed and edited and produced all on the iPad using LumaFusion for iOS. And incredible application, very, very powerful and unbelievable performance. And it's actually just as easy to edit on the iPad, if not easier, than doing it in Windows on a very capable application. It's been an interesting experience, and with each new thing that I try to look into on the iPad, I've been able to do it pretty well. It's not a 100% replacement for a Windows desktop or laptop, but that's okay. When I'm in the office, I work on my workstation. It's when I'm out of the office that I want the capability to use my iPad to get these little tasks done, whether it's email or a document or a proposal or invoices or debugging code. I've now figured out now I can do that. So mobile computing is changing. There are incredible opportunities for working remotely. You don't have to be tied to a desk. You don't have to be in an office. You can go on a half-day vacation with your family, go to the theme park, go camping early on a Friday and have some accessibility if you need it in an emergency. And you can just do that with an iPad. So I'm hoping to be able to just pick up my iPad and walk out the door without my laptop and not have any concerns or be nervous about my ability to support my customers. And I'm finding that my laptop is no longer required for many tasks. I will bring my laptop and the iPad together, And my goal for the last month or two has been to not use my laptop and do everything I can on the iPad, just because it's smaller form factor, lighter, long battery life, and just as a challenge. And it's worked out really well. And tablet and mobile phone apps are becoming tremendously capable. It is really amazing how clean and simple and effective they are, and how they are able to replace a lot of Windows application functionality. And in this example, I showed that you can use Azure Functions continuous deployment to reduce your dependencies on things like Visual Studio. So you don't have to have full Visual Studio on Windows or Mac in order to make changes and redeploy to Azure Functions. Well, I hope you found that useful and interesting. This was just a personal challenge that I set up to see if I could utilize my iPad more and have less dependency on a specific Windows laptop. And I think it worked out well. Obviously, not all situations are going to work with the Azure Functions continuous deployment or Azure Apps Services continuous deployment, but it's just a demonstration of how, with a little bit of creativity, you can use an alternate platform, alternate workflow, and give yourself a little more freedom when working remotely. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Steve Endo. Check out my blog at blog.steveendo.com. Thanks for watching.